The Book of the Dead is one of the most well-known texts from ancient Egypt. It appears in the movie The Mummy, for example, as a kind of device to resurrect the dead. Some people also tend to think of this book as a kind of Bible for the ancient Egyptians. But the truth is that the Book of the Dead is neither one thing nor the other. In this video, we're going to talk about exactly what this text collection is all about. Let's take the opportunity to analyze, part by part, a very famous copy of the Book of the Dead, which is called the Ani Papyrus. What exactly is this book? The Book of the Dead is not exactly a book, and it is not exactly of the dead, right? Why is it not exactly a book? Because what is called the Book of the Dead, right? This name was given by a European researcher in the 19th century turning to the 20th century. The Egyptians did not call these texts by that name. But what was called by researchers and Egyptologists the Book of the Dead was a collection of several short and independent texts, certain that appear in pyramids, appear in sarcophagi, appear in statues, appear on papyrus. Several copies of the Book of the Dead we find on papyrus, but they are a collection of independent texts, so there are about 200 texts, but no copy of the Book of the Dead has all 200, and they're not always in the same sequence. So it's more of a set, right, a collection of texts that have been selectively turned into papyrus or back on the walls of the tomb and things like that. And why isn't it exactly also a Book of the Dead, right? Because the idea of the Book of the Dead is not so good. It's relatively good because it applies to the funerary context, right? Therefore, these texts surround dead people. But it's much more focused on life, in this case the afterlife, than on the idea of death as something erased, right? As an end. On the contrary, the Book of the Dead, these texts that make up the Book of the Dead, right? They serve precisely to ensure a good passage for the survival of the person in the afterlife, to vitalize that person, to protect him from the dangers of the afterlife, to restore the senses that were lost at the moment of the first death, so to speak. That's why this title, Book of the Dead, isn't so appropriate. Some authors prefer to use the term that the Egyptians used for these texts, which are words to go out into the light or words to go out into the day, in the sense of words to find this new reality, this second life, which is very open, very sunny, as we will see in a moment, right? I have obtained here the most well-known and complete copy of the Book of the Dead that we have preserved, which is the Papyrus of Ani. It's this guy. That's represented here, and he was a scribe from the city of Thebes, so that's also interesting because the Book of the Dead was relatively democratic, so that more people could have access to these texts and take them to the tomb to be favored by these texts than, for example, the pyramid texts and the sarcophagus texts, which are two other collections of older texts that we find in Egypt related to the funerary context. So, even to illustrate this, right, this here is the Pyramid of Unas. Egypt is quite destroyed on the outside, but on the inside it is well preserved, and there is this ceiling here that reproduces the sky. Well, with the stars, and on the walls there are also a series of incantations that should favor life after death, right, the afterlife situation of the person who was buried in here. So this here is part of the so-called pyramid texts, and so only those who had pyramids had access to it, right? So very few people here are already. It's another example of another collection of texts, which are the sarcophagus texts. So here we have a sarcophagus, and it's full of texts, both inside and out, right? Here, too, inside we also find texts, right? It's not just images, there are texts too. And these images complement or replace some texts. These scenes are called vignettes, right? And here we have, for example, the Book of Two Paths reproduced inside this coffin, right? This lute. What did I want to call it? These boxes used to store the sarcophagus and the dead, the mummies, and so on, right? So all of these are this kind of text related to the Egyptian funerary context. But we also find the Book of the Dead on papyri. So it was easier to acquire, even though it was a more elitist thing, but it was much easier to acquire than the other types of text, right? And this is a part of the Book of the Diani Papyrus, which has that scene that is perhaps the most famous of all, which is the weighing of the heart. I'll go into detail in a moment about this scene, but first, just to show you what Dean's papyrus would look like in its entirety, right? Much bigger than that. The Janai's papyrus would be that, right? Of course not. Thin like that, but if it were to be unrolled completely, it would be about 20 m long, so it would be a lot. It wouldn't exactly be a book that you would open and read like you were taking I don't know, War and Peace. Sit on the couch and flip through it. That's not what's going to be done. It's going to be rolled up and put to the side for the dead person. Right? So it wasn't exactly meant to be read, the words themselves. The text itself would have a magical effect to protect the dead. Right. If we zoom in on the Ani papyrus, here we can do an analysis of the first part of it here, and it starts with Ani, who's represented here with his wife, who was also a singer in the Temple of Amun. If I'm not mistaken, she's holding a sistine here that's a kind of rattle, a typical Egyptian musical instrument, and they have in front of them a table with various offerings placed on. So these very sharp little triangles here are incense. They represent incense. There's also some feet here of a cow lying down, also a very typical offering, and also cakes and breads, and down here there's a lotus flower as well, very much related to this issue of rebirth, because the lotus opens again every morning, right? Because of the sun's effect, right? So it accompanies the sun. In a way it praises the sun, worships the sun. It is opened and revived by the sun. So it appears a lot in this context, also related to funerary resuscitation, right? The expectation of the person's resuscitation in the other world. It's important to say that too, right? It's not resurrection in the sense that the person will return to that same world, the body will lie there, but in another dimension the person survives, right? And then the next scene that we find is like this praise of the sun represented here. We have a pillar, which is a scriptural pillar, which is a symbol associated with Iris, who is the sovereign over the world of the dead. But, as I said, the world of the dead for the Egyptians is not a gloomy, sad, gloomy place, as it was for the Mesopotamians, for example. For the Egyptians, this world of the dead was a highly solar place, because the sun spends 12 hours there, just as it spends 12 hours here, right? In the Egyptian conception, the solar boat, after crossing the sky during the day, in the world of the living, it crosses the world of the dead at 12 o'clock in the night. So it's as solar as the world of the living. And then we have the sun disk represented here. This sun disk is being lifted by an ankh, this ankh cross that represents life, vitality, and these little arms raised like this also represent vitality, because the word K, which is a word for vitality in Egyptian, the hieroglyph that means this word is just two little arms raised like this, right? And you also have the baboons making this gesture, which is also a gesture of worship to the sun disk and the goddesses Isis and Nephs, who are the wives of the sisters and wives of Osiris here, also praising and propitiating this symbol, which is the symbol of Osiris, the sovereign of the dead, and at the same time a symbol of solar vitality. And then next we have Ani again with his wife here, already in more ceremonial clothes with the offerings, and then finally we move on to this scene. Enough of this scene here, which is the scene of Ani and her wife going to the heart weighing again. But before that, let me actually grab a text so that we can get the texts as well, so that we can read them and evaluate them along with these images. A text that could accompany this image here is precisely the hymn to Osiris, right? Again represented by this pillar. Although there is no image of it here, it is represented in the form of this pillar, and all copies of the Book of the Dead practically begin with the same text, which is the hymn to Osiris, which I will pick up here in this translation. And there is here, "O Ino," the introductory text to Osiris. There he says, "Hail Osiris, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Sovereign of Sovereigns. May you grant me power in heaven, strength on earth, and righteousness in the region of the dead, to enter and exit unhindered through all the gates of the underworld. May I receive bread in the house of fresh water and a table of offerings from Heliopolis, having my feet firmly planted in the field of reeds, which is its barley and its wheat of the field of reeds. Belong to the K of Osiris N." What is this Osiris N here? This N is actually the name, and insert here the name of the deceased, because these books, right? These copies were produced on an almost industrial scale. We have leather molds, for example, that served as a reference to produce the papyri, and then you can even prepare some, leave the gap, and when someone buys the book you go there and fill it in with the name of the person. So if it were for me, for example, it would be Osiris, Henry. And why the deceased is called Osiris is because there is the process of Osirization. There is an identification of the deceased with the Lord of the world of the dead. The Egyptian religion is full of this, right? Of these assimilations of these one thing is several. But it's one and it's one. But it's several, right? The boundaries of the personality of the gods are very fluid. So the deceased himself is identified as the sovereign of the world of the dead, because the deceased will kind of Recap following the example of Osiris who died and was reanimated, and I've already made a video here on the channel about the myth of Osiris. I think it's not worth repeating here. Video later you can look, and the dead man also recapitulates the story of the sun. That's why he's often identified with her also, right? Who the solar god is, but then there's this introductory H to Osiris, and then we go back to the papyrus and we move on to that scene, right? Which is the weighing of the heart, in which we have Ani and his wife here, and on the inside we also have Ani represented in different ways. The heart here represents one of the aspects of the dead, which is their memory, their experience, right? What happened in life different from our conception that the brain stores memory. Today the Egyptians thought of the heart as this center of memory of experience, so the heart that is called IB and is representing exactly that here. What happened in the life of the person here has this character here, with the body of a bird and a falcon, right? And the head of a human, which is another aspect of the dead man, which is the BA, which is the personality, basically what differentiates one person from another. Here the physical body represented by the funeral box, and this figure here represents the fate of the dead man, who is called Chu, if I don't remember mistake. Sure. This is written here in the hieroglyphics. And these two women represent yesterday and tomorrow, representing precisely the passage of time. In addition, we have here above a baboon representing the god Totes, who is also represented outside the scene, taking notes. He's the scribe of the gods, right? And he writes the result of the weighing of the heart here, right? So he's represented twice in this scene, like it's a comic book, right? In this scene, he is like that. In this external scene, he is in another way. And of course, we have Anubis, who is the favorite god of many Egyptians because he really is very stylish, right? With this jackal head that's calibrating the scales here. So to him, he's a god related to the funeral and this passage, right? A psychopompous god who transports the dead to the next life. He is then taking care that the process is well conducted. And we also have the ostrich feather, the feather of Mat, who is a goddess who personifies truth, justice, and order. So what will happen here is precisely to see if the person's heart, if the person's experience, if the person's memory corresponds to what is expected, order, justice, Mat, and all this is also being witnessed by a series of other gods who are up here, right? The first of them is the sun god Ar, who has the sun disk on his head. Again, the sun is a god related to the dead because of its own trajectory, right? Since he dies and comes back every day. In Mesopotamia it's also like that, right? Shamash, in Gilgamesh epic, appears as someone who travels through the world of the dead after Ar. Osiris is represented here with his crown, which is traditional in Upper and Lower Egypt, and several other gods here in sequence, all of them propitiated by a table with offerings. And if this weighing happens and it is noticed that the heart does not correspond to the order, then the little one will signal this unfavorable result and the heart will be swallowed by this goddess, which is Ammit, who is a monstrous goddess, right? With the head of a crocodile, with the front part, in this case, of a leopard, and the back of a hippopotamus. This varies a lot. But in this papyrus it was represented in this way, and then the person will not have access to life after death, right? Then he will really die. He will not continue his existence after the first death. And then to get the texts that correspond to this here, we have the 30B incantation, right? Which is the enchantment called systasis, which is precisely the weighing of the heart, the weighing of the soul, right? Psyche. And it says this, "O my heart that I received from my mother." This is the dead one speaking to the heart, right? To his own heart, "O my heart which I received from my mother, O my heart which I received from my mother, O my heart of my different ages, do not stand as a witness against me. Don't be contrary to me in court. Don't be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the scale, because you're my K, right? My vitality that was in my body, the protector that made my limbs healthy. Go to the good place where we are going. Don't make my name stink in the court that makes men. Do not lie about me in the presence of God. It's good that you listen." So it's as if the dead here threatens the heart in a certain way, so that he wouldn't say anything unfavorable to himself, right? In this scene of the weighing of the analysis, he gives the soul and then the text goes on to say, "Toot." So the weighing has already happened and now that scribe, right? The judge of truth tells the great End that it is the other gods who witness the process, right? and that he is in the presence of Osiris. Listen to this word of absolute truth. I have judged the heart of the deceased, and his soul is his witness. His actions are only on the grand scales, and no evil has been found in him. He did not decrease the offerings in the temples. He did not destroy what had been done. He did not speak deceitfully while on earth. Then, he talks about the suitability of the person so that he can advance. And the great end. So those gods who are up there say, Atot. This statement of yours is true. Osiris, right? So-and-so is justified and right. He did nothing wrong. Actually, right? He did nothing wrong. There is no charge against him before us. Ammit. This monstrous goddess will have no power over him. Let the offerings be granted to him, placed in the presence of Osiris, and that a grant of land be established in the field of the offerings as to the followers of Horus. Then he shall be added to this community who are the followers of Horus, the justified people, and there he shall have even a portion of land, a place to be, so says Horus. And then Horus says, after all this speech, son of Isis, I come to you, O infer that it is a title of Osiris, and I bring so-and-so to you. Your heart is true, having passed the scales, and he has not acted against any god or goddess to judge you in writing what was said to End and Mat, the great testified. Then all these very important gods testify so-and-so, so that he may be accepted, that he may be given bread and beer in the presence of Osiris, and he will be forever like the followers of Horus. And then, finally, the dead man himself says so-and-so says, here I am in his presence, O Lord of the West. The West is associated with the right of death. The necropolises were on the west bank of the Nile. They were on the west side of the Nile because that's where the sun dies, right? So there's this symbolism of death as well. There is no misconduct in my body. I didn't deliberately lie. There was no second fault with P. That I may be like the favored ones who are in your retinue, O Osiris, a great favored by the good God, a beloved of the Lord of the Two Lands, so-and-so, justified before Osiris. And so ends the 30B incantation that's being played by this vignette, right? This part here that we have seen actually has a part that we have not yet seen, because after the person is justified before the gods, Horus himself, who appears here, takes Ani by the hand and takes him to the hall of Osiris, where Ani is once again propitiating Osiris with offerings. And he's got white hair here, maybe representing something age-related or maybe something related to a ceremonial wig, right? I don't know exactly. I don't know if the exact meaning of this change in hair color here is known, but there are a number of offerings here to propitiate Osiris. And Osiris is here in your salon next to Isis and Neft and also has a lotus in front of him, right? And at the top of the lotus we have the four sons of Horus that often appear in the canopus vessels or canopic jars that were where the internal organs were kept, the lungs and the liver, right? These organs were removed so that the body rotted more slowly, right? To better preserve the body. So I've already made a video here on the channel about mummification as well. Then you can check out the details of this process in these other videos, and then we have what's happening here. Everything is happening in the world beyond, right? And then we move on to this image that shows what's going on out there in our world here. Which is this box, right? With an Anubis. There's even a very similar box that was found in Tutankhamun's tomb with Osiris or Anubis in this full jackal form, right? And it's being transported by some people and also by an ox cart, right? And here it's like you enlarge this box, and here we have the woman probably crying for him. There's Ani here in a sarcophagus and the priest in leopard clothes taking care here that all the rites are performed in the best possible way, and here further ahead the people taking treasures here to Ani's grave. The mourners who had this craft of mourning for the dead. This is very common in the ancient Near East in general, even in some parts of Europe. Even today in Italy there is still in some places this issue of mourners hiring women to mourn as a kind of funeral rite, and here we have the priest in leopard clothes who extends a ceremonial object here towards the body of Ani for the opening ceremony of the mouth, or the rite of opening the mouth, which is as follows. How the person is clearly there, inert, immobile, his physical body bandaged, with his eyes covered, his mouth covered, his ears covered, how this person will have freedom, how he will walk, how he will see, how he will taste things in the world beyond. But in the world in which she already lives, right after her first death, this is done by various rituals in which she is there, the Book of the Dead, among them the opening of the mouth, which precisely returns these senses to the person, and then the text that corresponds to it, right? The enchantment of opening the mouth. My mouth is opened by Petha, who is another god also represented as a dead man, and what was in my mouth was released by my local god. Tot arrives, in fact, full and equipped with magic, and Set's ties that restricted my mouth have been released. Atum removed them and expelled Seth's restraints. So the god Set, who is a god who kills Osiris in the traditional myth, represents death here, right? It represents the attempt to leave the person inert, but this is overcome by the other gods who free the person from the bonds of Seth. Perhaps a reference precisely to the bands that kept the person's body attached, right? In the funeral situation. So this is one of several incantations that aim to give back the senses and vitality to the person so that they can really experience, right? The afterlife, the world beyond, with all its capabilities. And then the scene continues, right? From that moment on, Anubis will take the dead person into the future. And then a number of others. The scenes appear here, right? Your wife Sanibar, some leopards with a sun disk, the heron and the lotus, various other symbols, and this papyrus goes on for several meters. Including another scene that's interesting to highlight are these guardians here, which are 42 gods who are also associated with a very famous incantation from the Book of the Dead, which are the so-called negative confessions. Enchantment 125. It says this, I am pure, 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 and no harm will come to me on this earth or in this hall of justice, because I know the names of the 42 gods that are in it. So here, the dead, before these guardians of the world of the dead, will say their names, which shows a certain dominion over these beings. That question of the name, right? Associated with a certain you have control over things. Know the names of things? This notion is also very common in the ancient Near East, usually in Mesopotamia, the region of Israel, and also in ancient Egypt. In addition to saying the names of these gods, which gives him a certain control over the gods, he also says something related to the fulfillment of the order, his suitability to Mat. Just as I said there when we were talking about enchantment 30b, so he will say, for example, O great itinerant road that came from Heliopolis, that is the name of the god, right, great itinerant road of Heliopolis, I have not committed Fossido embrace of fire that came from there, he will speak in the various provinces, right, I did not steal the great nose that came from Hermopolis, I was not miserly, O swallower of shadows that came from the cave, I didn't steal, and so it goes, including probably. These 42 gods have some correspondence with the right 42 nomoi. In fact, the 42 provinces of ancient Egypt, as if the world of the dead was some kind of mirror of the world of the living, right? The dead is a collection of various texts, so these various incantations, these various texts meant to ensure a good afterlife for the dead, it can be in the form of papyrus like we have here, but it can be inscribed on a wall, it can be inscribed on statues, it has the so-called shabti, which are little statues that appear frequently, sometimes even in large numbers, in Egyptian tombs that have a specific incantation of the shab, which is incantation 6, if I'm not mistaken. Written on the back and in front of it, on Tutankhamun's mask, there are some chapters of the Book of the Dead also written on the back. It was very common, even from about 1400 in Egypt, for these texts to circulate in these different forms associated with the funerary context, right? They circulated so much that we still have them today, right? Many of these copies have been preserved. We can study this text with rare ease when we compare it with others that are much more incomplete, others that have been lost forever, and so on, right? But that's it, as always. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next ones.